factor that is relevant to the counterfactual account is how now the remainder of the chemical disarmament material charge, what is displayed as a utility counterfactual system together. Fully removed the fire. So I think there's a logical
yeah, so I think people want to comment on the ensuing discussion.
spoiler.
Pardon? It's quite. Is it okay? You can. Okay, good. Now we can. So I was just saying that you are the diligent portion of the participation group that paid attention to the timing of the session. We had to start early in order to fit in everything we wanted to do today, and it'll be a going back and forth, starting off this morning in this plenary room for this discussion of chemical weapons elimination, then having a break, and then our 4 simultaneous sessions taking place on the first and second floors, and then coming back here for the final session on working for a successful 2015 NPT review conference. I'm Mark Fitzpatrick, the Director of the Non-Proliferation Disarmament Program at IISS in London. I'm also the Vice Chair of the EU Non-Proliferation Consortium. It's my pleasure today to lead this panel on one of the most topical topics on the non-proliferation agenda, eliminating chemical weapons. This session, of course, plays off of yesterday's keynote morning presentation by OPCW Director General Ahmed Uzumcu. And we won't, we'll try consciously not to repeat the things that he covered, but to go forward a step in our analysis of the situation. Today's panel is an all-England-based panel, and it wasn't consciously chosen that way, and I apologize to those who think that England shouldn't have such a large role in our EU proceedings, but we're trying to keep them anchored in the EU.
I'm of Scottish descent.
Richard tells me he's Scottish descent, and of course I'm not British at all, but we all are based in England. Richard Guthrie, who will be starting, is the editor of CBW Events. He's an independent analyst, one of the most highly sought-after analysts on chemical and biological weapons. You may see him on BBC and other media from time to time commenting on the situation. He's going to give an overview of issues concerning elimination. Paul Schulte, my fellow London-based analyst, will then talk about the implications of the Syrian case for the wider international system and arms control. Paul is honorary professor at the Institute for Conflict, Cooperation and Security at Birmingham University. He has several other titles, but I'll turn you to the biography in the app to read more about him. And then finally, Nomi Bar-Yaacov, also based in London, a foreign policy advisor on Middle Eastern affairs and an associate fellow at Chatham House. I've asked to speak about extending the CWC throughout the Middle East. So we'll go in that order. We'll each of them will speak for about 10 minutes. And I'll ask Richard to kick us off, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll give what some might think is a fairly gentle overview, but I assure you my words in the Q&A may be a little firmer. A presentation under this title of Elimination of Chemical Weapons will always be a creature of its time. If I'd given this during the CWC negotiations, they would have focused on which governments might declare having a chemical weapons program that would have to be eliminated. At entry into force in 1997 of the CWC, everyone expected Russia and the US to declare an active stockpile, but it surprised many that India and the Republic of Korea also declared possession. Even more surprising was the revealing of the Albanian possession of materials. A decade ago, it would have been on the technical and financial issues surrounding the destruction of Russian and American chemical weapons. That their stocks, for which it was so clearly apparent they were not going to meet their deadlines. Even just a couple of years ago, the focus would still have been on the US and Russia, and there were some concerns emerging about non-states parties. But today, obviously, Syria is a particular focus. The problem of past stocks in the US and Russia has not gone away, but steady, if delayed, progress is still being made. So in this short presentation, I'd like to first look at Syria Second, at achieving and maintaining a chemical weapons-free world once elimination is hopefully completed. And to finish off with some observations of some common myths and understandings. On Syria, an often unspoken lesson is that we should raise our expectations of what can be achieved when the political will is there. In this case, the political will was there because of an outrageous act, the use of chemical weapons on a scale that meant it could not be hidden or doubted. As with all intergovernmental organisations, the OPCW derives the level of its political significance in large part from the political significance the CWC states parties give it. We must maintain a level of political will to put increased pressure on the remaining non-states parties to the Convention, especially those that may possess chemical weapons or had a programme in the past. There is still more work to be done in Syria. The recent fact-finding mission concluded that the information received, and I quote, lends credence to the view that toxic chemicals, most likely pulmonary irritating agents such as chlorine, have been used in a systematic manner in a number of attacks. End of quote. The use of novel techniques for the destruction of Syrian chemicals, for example, the use of equipment on board a ship, not to be confused with dumping material at sea, which was stopped in the 1970s, and the use of commercial hazardous waste destruction facilities was significant. Some of the destruction of production and mixing equipment in Syria was not very elegant. Put it on the ground and run a heavy vehicle across it. It was rapid and highly effective, but relatively unconventional. The use of commercial facilities for disposal of materials underscores the dual-use nature of the problem we face. That brings me to my second theme, the goal of elimination, which is nothing more or less than achieving a chemical weapon-free world. Much of this will obviously depend on regional politics, as will be the focus of one of our other presentations this morning. But I'd like just to say a stark fact, that although the Middle East has only ever accounted for a very small proportion of chemical weapons produced since the Second World War, depending on how you count them, less under 5%, yet it is the only region in which lethal chemical weapons have been confirmed to be used by military forces against humans since the Second World War. Maintaining a chemical weapon-free world is sometimes referred to as a non-proliferation activity. Do we have a common understanding of what we mean by some of these terms we use so often? So from where I stand, the distinctions are clear. Disarmament, the weapons themselves are the problem. You've got to get rid of them. Arms control, weapons contribute to problems and so need to be managed, but the weapons themselves don't need to be eliminated completely. Non-proliferation, well, that is technically about the spread of weapons and is often translated into the questions of the wrong weapons in the wrong hands. Preventing the collapse of a chemical weapon-free world requires stopping new acquisitions, not the stopping of the spread of weapons from an existing source. Therefore, non-proliferation is historically a loaded term and should be used with care. It is suitable for use in the nuclear field, but in the chemical and biological spheres it can bring greater costs than benefits. And here it's interesting, those listening carefully to the OPCW Director General yesterday may have noticed he emphasised preventing re-emergence of chemical weapons rather than using the term non-proliferation in relation to the post-destruction phase. To have a chemical weapon-free world, we need to be confident there is a common understanding of what a chemical weapon is. Chemical warfare is the use of toxic effects of substances to cause harm to living things and can be targeted against humans, animals, or plants. But the definition of a chemical weapon in international law is much wider than this. One myth is that the chemical weapons definition only applies to weaponized materials. CWC Article 2, Paragraph 1 includes within the definition of chemical weapons, and I quote, toxic chemicals and their precursors, except when intended for purposes not prohibited under this convention, as long as the types and quantities are consistent with such purposes. This concept is known as the general purpose criterion and is the greatest strength of the CWC, as it prevents loopholes emerging which would appear under a list-based system. Everything is prohibited unless it can be shown to be allowed. And it is that provision that means that chlorine, when it's dropped in a barrel from a helicopter, is a chemical weapon, but chlorine in a storage area ready to use for water purification is not. Another myth is that national chemical control requirements of the CWC are limited to the control of scheduled substances. And it's true the schedules are used to operationalise the convention. But the CWC contains what is known as the Melander Chapeau in Article 6. And I quote, "Each state party shall adopt the necessary measures to ensure that toxic chemicals and their precursors are only developed, produced, otherwise acquired, retained, transferred or used within its territory or any other place under its jurisdiction or control for purposes not prohibited under the Convention." No list, no schedule, every toxic chemical. A further myth is that chemical, and indeed biological methods of warfare are much, much, much less significant than nuclear weapons. The creation of this myth was deliberate. It enabled the elimination of these weapons. Anyone who sat through the difficult discussions within NATO in the 1980s about whether it should adopt a doctrine on the use of chemical weapons or what to do with the hundreds of tons of VX based in Germany would not think chemical weapons were so much less significant than nuclear weapons. The fact the myth has become normalised shows how effective it has been. There is much to be learnt in the nuclear field from the prolonged and sometimes quite subtle efforts carried out to delegitimise chemical and biological weapons, and which led to their elimination being made possible. So in summary, in this short introduction, global elimination of chemical weapons is well underway, and we are working towards a chemical weapon-free world. Syria was a tremendous achievement, but there is much more to be done. Non-proliferation is a difficult term to use in the chemical sphere. The CWC has all toxic chemicals within its scope, and be careful of myths and understandings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the most succinct exposition of the issues that I've heard, and I think we'd want to be exploring some of these a bit more. And I think you'll have to explain to me one more time why non-proliferation isn't the right term, because I asked you to keep it so short. You did keep it short. So Syria was a tremendous success, but there's much still to be done, and I think Paul Schulte will be going into that in somewhat more detail, or maybe not. But
I'll try.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Of Richard's introduction, but let me say that similarly, that eliminating chemical weapons is not a one-off operation. It's going to require continuing pressures, moral, legal, regulatory, political, and maybe military, to stop states and now groups turning chemical products into chemical weapons. Chlorine, potential chemical weapons will always be with us, and with advancing science, they may be more easily with us, more pervasively with us. And the return of good old chlorine after 1915 indicates that in a very poignant and disgusting way. So if that's the task, not to get rid of a few hundred tons of eventually admitted chemicals, some of which were obsolescent anyway, let's examine the Syrian case against that agenda. And like everything in non-proliferation or maybe politics, this is a glass half full or half empty situation. I don't want to sound grudging, but we're only going to get the glass completely full if we look at the actual filling of the vessel so far and see what the impediments are. Nothing I want to say is aimed against the OPCW and the UN joint mission. People there were brave, energetic, and technically competent. And I'm not saying that a military attack would have led to a better result. But I do want to look at what this shows about the international system and its capacity to deal with this kind of event. So I've been compiling a scorecard, which I can make available on the website. And I say it's about 2.3 cheers for the international system at the moment. I'd like it to move to more than that, but I'll explain why. Let's look at some facts. Syria was not indeed, as Angela Kane said last night, a declared chemical weapons possessor. Very few states are. But it was a chemical and biological and missile nexus state by repute. There was quite a large literature, energetically propagated, I suspect, by Israeli analysts, to explain what it had. And VX and Scuds were aimed at Tel Aviv as a kind of deterrent against Israel going further than the Syrians could bear. Whether that was effective or not, I have no idea. I think it's probably in the realm of unanswerable. But the Syrians thought it would be useful, and they spent billions doing it, and they got absolutely no objection. No Arab state made reference to this at all. So it was a kind of accepted, although recessed part of the international landscape. And the Syrians were leading practitioners of what I call diplomatic autism, like they refused to answer any questions on anything. The most high-profile example of this is not chemical, but it was the mysterious box on the Euphrates, the suspected reactor that they wouldn't discuss, nobody wanted to talk about, but was bombed. They suffered nothing from that. Their refusal to, apart from the loss of a rather expensive facility, nobody criticized because nobody wanted to talk about it. But their Westphalian opacity, i.e., the privileged insistence that the modern state doesn't have to answer anything from anyone except under extreme legal or political threat, that went unchallenged. And they remain in that position. And in the last days before the Russian-American deal, they were still not admitting they had chemical weapons of any kind at all. Nobody has made much attempt to criticize that approach. That's one background. Then last year there was a crime. It was a serious war crime. It was possibly also a blunder. We don't know why they attacked. We have a strong suspicion of who attacked Ghouta, but if it was the Assad regime, why did they do that? What was the operational intent? We don't understand that, which should be a reminder of these things. About 1,400 people died. I had this strange experience of being asked to comment wisely and compassionately, watching them dying about 5 times on TV channels, which gives me no special moral status, but it does remind me that this would not have happened except for that crime or blunder. And then that was followed by the more or less plausible threat of American military action. It's clear that Obama was not excited by having to do this, but it was sufficiently plausible to broker the famous Russian and American deal. Without that threat, there would have been no chemical disarmament in Syria. How often will that happen in future? Especially in the worsening confrontation between Russia and the West, where the costs of military action will be complicated. But that crime has not been systematically investigated. It's something I suspect a provincial police force could have sorted out in a morning, but the international community has not been able to come up with an effective consensual coroner. And if you want an ugly historical precedent, I suggest Chatham would. Very large numbers of people known to have been murdered, but for 40 years it was not politically possible to get agreement on who did it, which tells you something about the background against which non-proliferation and the rest of the Syrian case will have to be handled. There is then a huge propaganda exercise, maybe by both sides, but somebody is lying. There's a Russian, Iranian Shiite position and a Western Sunni position about who did this. This is getting very elaborated, and now to come up with a finding about who did it is going to discredit one side or the other, and that becomes a political problem in itself and an impediment to progress. Now, then we have the completion of the Syrian disarmament. Yesterday, Samantha Power in the UN is talking about the considerable questions left to be dealt with, the discrepancies in the Syrian account. Further military US action at this stage is extremely unlikely. I think we would all agree that the stakes are not high enough. So that's a leverage that won't be applied. And the problem will be that verification may cross over into accusation. If you trace all the Syrian chemical production and holdings over the years, what's that going to show about what was used, the particular kinds of sarin that were used in Ghouta? So either that's admitted and it pins the blame on Assad and co, or it's not admitted and it raises problems for the effectiveness of verification. And I think the issue here is slightly similar to the PMD dimension of the Iranian case. How is it possible to reach a deal, to reach
an agreement to clear up a case without the revelation of past historical facts, which may be politically unbearable for the state under question and its superpower or P5 sponsors. But without that, how else can they be trusted? And I see that is a significant difficulty here and in other cases. On the elimination, it was technically effective, dexterous even, but it was ad hoc. It was done at it was done at international expense, mostly American expense, saved the Syrians money to spend on their civil war unhindered, and we get a strong evidence of widespread NIMBYism. You know, not in my backyard, not in my Mediterranean. The Albanians won't accept things being done at sea. The Cretans object to things being done hundreds of miles from their bit of sea. And the US and Russia, although any chemical engineer would tell you the obvious thing to do would have been to add these chemicals to the large stockpiles awaiting destruction under properly constructed conditions in Russia and America. That cannot even be considered. That's closed off. It's like a law of nature, physics. Can't possibly be done in our countries because our local laws won't allow it. So that's not a good precedent for future burden sharing. But let's look at the other precedents. That's the investigation and prosecution of perpetrators. There's little deterrent value, I think, at the moment. It looks as though you can do chemical warfare and get away with it. And you can indeed even build up plausibility within the international community. You become a good, responsible actor if you then comply. And it is alleged by the Syrian opposition, but they would say that anyway, that the Syrian behavior with barrel bombs, let alone chlorine, has become even less inhibited as a result. So that there is a payoff. Maybe they will get tracked down by the International Criminal Court. Maybe, if they lose the civil war, they will be extradited. But there'll be so many other things on the indictment sheet that are we looking at any significant stretch in prison for the people who did this attack as opposed to all the other war crimes? So I doubt that the deterrent value in the future is going to be very great, particularly as we now seem to be moving into a pattern of irregular use of chemicals in scruffy, low-intensity war that was never expected in the Chemical Weapons Convention. The OPCW doesn't seem tooled up to deal with this, and we get this fascinating diversity of views from international organs, paralyzed, I suspect, by the threat of Russian vetoes in the UN. But you do get UN human rights people saying it's quite clear the government is systematically behind this, and the OPCW can't comment. And I'm fascinated by a kind of cognitive blinkering. The OPCW has samples. The UN has samples from the Selstrom missions, tissue samples, soil samples. They cannot be put together and technically compared. There's a quote put out by the BBC by an OPCW official saying quite correctly, I think, we have these things. They could be done technically. This would be simple. It cannot be done politically. That says something about the state of the international system. And we get also the false flag, chemical weapons as an element in false flag operations. You may not want to be a declared chemical state, but it's quite useful to indicate that your antagonists are users of abhorrent forms of warfare. And there doesn't seem to be yet an effective, fast method of sifting out false flag accusations. The system, when you have partisan involvement of different P5 members, doesn't seem to allow for that. And this, therefore, is a case which will show our ability to reduce the trust deficit in the Middle East, which makes the Middle East zone so desirable, but at the moment so impossible. Can we get sufficient accountability in the declaration and the accusations? And if we can't, what is that going to do in creating incentives for Israel or Egypt to reconsider their position about the universalizability of the CWC? More to say, but maybe in questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. You've, in addition to laying things out so clearly, gave us a few key words that may have been tweeted already: diplomatic autism, no international coroner, cognitive blinkering.
Don't forget Westphalian opacity.
Westphalian opacity. But you ended on the point that I think is a good place to turn to Nomi. to talk about extending the CWC to the two states in the Middle East who have not yet acceded to it. So, Nomi, please.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this distinguished panel and in this very important setting that is aiming to achieve a lot. In particular, we're focusing on trying to aim to achieve universalization of the Chemical Weapons Convention by April 2015, the anniversary of IPRA, the first use of chemical weapons. So let's try and make this a goal and try to see how we can get there. That will be the focus of my talk, just a few pragmatic steps in terms of trying to get the two countries in the Middle East that have not acceded yet, Israel and Egypt, to in the case of Egypt, to sign and ratify, and in the case of Israel, to ratify. I'm slightly more optimistic than my friend Paul, maybe because we come from different schools of thoughts, different backgrounds, and I would just like to air my views very briefly. Just to recap, and only 6 countries in the world have not joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, the CWC, with Somalia and Syria acceding last year, and Myanmar and Angola having stated their commitment to accession this year. South Sudan is also likely to accede when circumstances permit. This really leaves only Israel and Egypt in the bad company of North Korea. Do Israel and Egypt, two democratic countries that take great pride in their democracy, really want to be left in this company? It is important to try to understand why these countries have not joined an international treaty that has become an international norm. So let's try to see what their concerns are and how we could potentially try to help them overcome them. I'd like to focus on three key questions. What will achieving universalization of the Chemical Weapons Convention mean for the Middle East? Why is it so important at this particular given moment in time, given that this is sort of a rather unique window of opportunity we have here? And most importantly, how do we get there? What practical steps will need to be taken in order to overcome fears and in some cases maybe excuses in order to achieve this goal? So what does eliminating or what does achieving universalization mean for the Middle East? As we're marking the centenary of the outbreak of World War I, and we're focusing on the Middle East, let's recall the very first victims of this war here in Belgium in Ypres were an Algerian battalion fighting alongside the French. The people of the Middle East have been affected by the use of chemical weapons or chemical agents over the past 100 years, and we just want to have a very, very brief reminder of this. In 1925, Spain used chemical weapons against Moroccans. I'm including the Maghreb in the broad Middle East. Lethal gas was used in Nazis' chambers in World War II, and many of the descendants of the survivors of the death camps now live in Israel, and this is very much part of the Israeli psychology and could be has to be taken into account when we think about these issues. In the 1960s, Egypt used chemical weapons in Yemen. In the 1980s, Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons both against the Kurdish population and in Iran. And there's strong allegations of the use of chemical weapons in Libya, that Libya used chemical weapons in Chad in 1987. As we've heard, and I won't go into the details of the use of chemical weapons and the OPCW UN work thereafter in Syria, but chemical weapons were used last year in 2013 and 2014. Since the OPCW has verified the destruction of the vast majority of Syria's chemical arsenal and is working to finalize arrangement for the destruction of the remaining facilities, what is left undestroyed, mostly building structures, does not pose a threat to neighboring countries anymore. And I think we really need to emphasize that in terms of discussing the timing. So what does achieving universalization mean? It means it would be a step forward towards the WMD free zone, a very important benchmark if Israel and Egypt were to accede. I'm not an advocate of trying to get them to accede necessarily at the same time, since I think they each one needs a tailored approach to each country. It could have far-reaching ramifications for sovereign states fighting, who are facing unprecedented threats from non-state actors like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State trying to lay their hands on chemical weapons. It would open up avenues for economic cooperation, as remaining outside the CWC prohibits the transfers of Schedule II chemicals. It would open up new avenues for discussing regional security, and most of all, it would protect the people, the civilians of all sovereign countries in the Middle East and the world against the growing threat of non-state actors. It would also send an important message that Middle Eastern states can achieve unity on an important issue, and by achieving such unity can maybe move on to discuss other issues of mutual concern, which could eventually lead to, as I said, the WMD-free zone, regional security, and hopefully peace. What is this about the timing? It has already been mentioned that Syria's chemical arsenal, the vast majority of it, has been destroyed. To quote my colleague Mark Fitzpatrick here, who blogged exactly a month ago, he says Israel's formal position that it won't ratify the CWC as long as other states in the region possess chemical weapons, refused to recognize Israel. Israel's position was demolished along with Syria's chemical weapons demolition. Israel has ceased to distribute gas masks, confirming by this action its belief that its population is no longer subject to a use to the threat of chemical weapons. So why not ratify? Both Israel and Egypt want something in return for ratification. They're using for signing and ratification, for joining. They are hoping to use their joining the convention as a bargaining chip for other things. In the case of Egypt, Egypt has long listed the linkage to Israel, to its demand that Israel ratify all non-proliferation treaties, particularly the NPT. And Israel wants something out of the accession too, like discussions on regional security or on conventional and non-conventional threats. But maybe it is time to set aside these differences and appeal to the more moral ground, and not only the moral ground. As I mentioned just now, this could really help to achieve regional security and combat the ongoing and growing threat, or unconventional threat. So the issue of timing. In the wake of the OPC, of the success of the OPCW mission, I somewhat differ from Paul. I think they achieved a tremendous amount. I think that the OPCW actually I think the OPCW has actually proved that it can verify the destruction of chemical weapons quite convincingly, and that this should be, you're welcome to comment, Paul, and that this should be a confidence building measure. I also think that in the Middle East, which is in such turmoil with so many terrorist groups posing a threat to regional security, it's time for responsible states to think about the best way to protect their citizens. It is time for Israel and Egypt to set their differences aside, ratify the convention, and ensure that we live in a safer world. Ratification will also, as I said in this time, be an important CBM towards the zone. So from here, we'd like to go into what practical steps can be taken in order to achieve this. Well, the simple answer is that Israeli and Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials should just draft letters of intent and ratify. But creating technical groups is probably the first step forward, and we'll do that separately. Create a technical group for Israeli experts and create a technical group for Egyptian experts to sit separately at this stage, since they're not ready for joint discussions on these issues, and map out A, their concerns, B, their suspicions, see their perception of the region and what can be done about it, particularly in threat, how to overcome this threat, and prospective collaboration between countries on issues of concern. Then, of course, there's the monitoring, verification and compliance and all the concerns that Paul has raised, and I think this would be a very good forum in which these issues could be discussed, because if you gather the technical experts at the initial stage who are well aware of the pros and cons and all the concerns, maybe they could flesh these out and iron out some of the problems, or at least commence a dialogue with the OPCW on them. Once sufficient progress is made within those groups, one should think of joining the groups together, potentially with third-party facilitation, potentially with OPCW involvement, so as to quell some of the fears and explain how things could be done, potentially tailor special agreements. The mapping out, one should raise concerns about the transparency and how to overcome them, and air concerns about the monitoring with the third parties, and highlight what the economic benefits are to these countries. Other confidence building could include the following technical steps. Israel and Egypt should consider issuing voluntary declarations of all industrial Schedule 2 and 3 and other chemical production facility, CPF sites. This would be seen as an initial confidence building measures and therefore not necessarily comprehensive. 2, this could be followed by voluntarily declaring Schedule 1 facilities, issuing an Article 10 type statement on chemical weapons defense program, since defense programs are legitimate under the Convention. 3, issuing a voluntary report or passing CWC-compatible implementing legislation, for example, on the export and transfer of chemicals, and to prevent the acquisition of materials and technologies by terrorists, so as to make a criminal offence with severe punishment as a deterrent. For example, Israel and Egypt could consider adopting technology transfer guidelines and the control list technologies as used by the participants in the Australia Group meeting. 5, inviting the OPCW Technical Secretariat to inspect one site, each according to verification annex rules. This would help Israel and Egypt familiarize themselves with the process. 6, inviting the Technical Secretariat to review lessons learned from such declaration, visits and inspections, with a view of making the verification exercise more acceptable to joining parties. Could also consider doing mock inspections, as currently I understand being done in Myanmar by the OPCW. This could help build confidence, in Israel and in Egypt about the actual process. Egyptian and Israeli accession, as I stated earlier, is not necessary. It's not essential. Working separately towards Israeli accession is advisable given the current specific, situation which Israel is in at present. The Israeli government is extremely sensitive to public opinion. So raising public opinion would be a very good idea, since the Prime Minister's office and the government tend to listen to what the public wants. Given that it's not on the current agenda, there's so many other more important issues, it is important to work through opinion shapers, civil society and parliamentarians. Israel is very wary of criticism of the conduct of its post-operations in Gaza. The CWC is one issue which is not a political issue. It's not an issue that the Prime Minister should have a problem with, unlike a coalition problem with, unlike issues concerning the Palestinians. So the conclusion is that if Israel ratifies the CWC, because it's more likely to at the moment, will Egypt want to be the only country in the world, save the DPRK, that has not ratified? Ratifying the CWC can be an important CBM towards further advancing the goal of a WMD-free zone and towards discussing regional security and eventually peace. I think both Egypt and Israel have much to gain and absolutely nothing to lose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nomi, for laying out both the benefits of accession throughout the region and the practical steps to getting there. these were three, I think, very impressive, deep presentations. And now we'll continue with our audience, not audience, participation interactions. I was, after last night's dinner interactions, I was wondering how I could emulate Nick Gowing in both collecting questions electronically and then doing the follow-up hard talk type questions. But I'm not even going to try because we didn't arrange for the Q&As to be delivered that way. So we'll do in the usual fashion. Jean-Paul Zonders caught my eye first of all, and then Maurizio. Okay, I'm going to... Go ahead, Jean-Paul.
Thank you very much. It's Jean-Pascal, but okay. Thank you to all speakers for very interesting presentations and the variations on the theme. But actually, my intervention, Mark, was prompted by your question as to why non-proliferation is wrong related to disarmament and prevention of future armament. The whole purpose with the CWC and the BTWC is simply to go to zero. In other words, if we achieve that finality of zero, there are simply no weapons anymore to proliferate. There is nothing to go for anymore. And even if you're thinking about underlying technologies and processes, I would say in chemistry, biology, and so on, things have become so ubiquitous all across the world that we are already in a post-proliferation phase, so to be. So the way I would view the CWC in the longer term is about shaping social preferences, about the application of certain types of technologies, and that shaping is against their use for weaponization. Just to give you a concrete example, we have been discussing Iran here too. And if you contrast the situation with nuclear weapons versus chemical weapons, the first thing you note is there is no definition of a nuclear weapon, legally binding, which is at the heart of the CWC, of course. There is no general purpose criterion, as Richard was explaining as a central part of him. So the core problem one sees there, how does one define the legitimacy of the application of certain types of technologies? How does one determine actually what percentage is the right percentage of enrichment? How does one determine how many centrifuges could be licit or illicit? So if we take that the finality with the CWC in disarmament is zero, and the same applies to everybody without any exception, then the question I have is, whatever agreement comes out in the negotiations with Iran, are you going to apply that to North Korea? Are you going to apply that to Israel? Thank you.
I don't know if you meant you, meaning Richard, or
no, my question
the international
was to
system.
you.
Got it. Maurizio.
Has been stimulated by the remark of Paul. Any WMD elimination program requires, roughly speaking, three actions. Elimination of weapons, destruction of the production and R&D facilities, and the reorientation of the WMD scientists. It's evident that in the case of Syria, the last action, the redirection of WMD scientists, about 4,000, is lacking. Why? And the second question, and then I stop, is for the excellent presentation of my old friend Nomi. It's true that there are similarity and difference and penalty, but it's evident also from the panel yesterday that the poor facilitator is in a very difficult situation, because if he's not able to convey this kind of, let's say, fata on the conference, the NPT review process will have a serious problem. So as a sort of saving phase, why not to think, or perhaps there is already some thinking, to have some formula. I'm not saying mechanism, formula, in the next review, NPT review conference, saying that the first step to establish a WMD free zone in Middle East is going through a biological, a chemical weapon-free zone. I mean, it's from a legal point of view, you don't do any penalty because Israel is not a member of NPT. This formula could be a sort of precursor, and it should be a sort of a saving phase. That are the questions.
Thank you, Maurizio. I'm going to go to take about 5 because we have about 10 people and we have about only round for 2 rounds. The gentleman in the 1, 2, 3, 4th row on the right. Yes. Oliver, turn yours off.
Is that on? Yeah. Okay. It's a question for Paul. Thank you all for the presentations. But a question for Paul. In light of the James Revel from the Harvard Sussex programme. In light of the pattern of scruffy use of chemical weapons in what some people have called new wars, I wonder whether is it time to revisit the threshold quantities and the schedules in the CWC, and indeed the focus, it seems, on militarily significant quantities, and is this something which is feasible in your view?
Thank you. I like the nice crispness of that question. Peter Sauzak from OPCW.
Thanks, Mark. Given my institutional affiliation, I'll try to be as brief as possible. There's a lot there to comment on. Just on Richard's presentation, I'll just make 2 points. I think universalization, obviously, is something we're very seized of, especially given the different strategic circumstances in the wake of the Syria mission. What's equally important, of course, is better national level implementation. What I'd like to call perhaps, I've just coined it now in my own head, a better functional universalization, which must be a priority. And in relation to non-proliferation, I don't want to dispossess you of your nomenclature. Thank you very much for the kind words about not preventing the re-emergence of chemical weapons. It's more, as you suggested very rightly, it's not, there won't be any chemical weapons, they can't proliferate. It's more than that, we're trying to prevent dual-use materials and technologies proliferating, but even more than that, we're anticipating new weapons types down the track, and that's what we're trying to prevent. And the fact that we're a science-based treaty tries to anticipate that, and that's something that's very relevant for other discussions we've had in this conference in relation to nuclear weapons as well, I think. In relation to Paul's comments, well, look, I'll be as dispassionate as possible, but please don't interpret this as being defensive. I think none of us, a year and a half ago, could have possibly imagined in our wildest dreams that Syria would accede to the Chemical Weapons Convention. For the reasons you outlined, Paul, they used it in their national security strategy. They did refer to chemical weapons last year in a public statement that they wouldn't use them against their population when the war was in full swing. But they did accede to the convention, and they acceded as the 8th possessor state. So that's quite significant. It does work as a deterrent, despite the fact that they had as part of their national security doctrine a chemical weapons stockpile. The international reaction to use of chemical weapons was such that it put enormous pressure on Syria to accede, and obviously with some assistance from bigger and powerful states parties. What I'd also like to say is that in a war that has had such an enormous human toll, and there's been no consensus in the international community on how to treat this conflict, the one point where we had consensus was on chemical weapons. So I think that shouldn't elude us. It's very, very important. On other points, I wouldn't confound disarmament with prosecution. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I don't work in those bodies, but we have seen prosecutions of war crimes many years after the fact. There is obviously a push on making sure that we can have accountability on the track, and that's something that's referenced in Security Council Resolution 2118. In terms of how we responded, well, the beauty of Syria becoming a state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention was that it was bound to a ready-made, tried and tested treaty, which is very comprehensive. So it wasn't ad hoc. It was ad hoc in terms of making the best of circumstances that are absolutely unprecedented and truly unique. We have never, ever dispossessed a country of its WMD arsenal in a time of war in compressed time frames. So it's to the credit of the international effort that we're able to do this. For the first time, we had to be flexible and innovative as well. As you mentioned, no land-based solution. Is that a shortcoming? No, we came up with seaborne destruction. Did it work? It worked extraordinarily well on the basis of technology that was already being used in the United States. Did we have any problems getting international effort together? Not at all. It's fully subscribed, not only financially, but in-kind assistance, which has been crucial. We've never sent inspectors to dangerous circumstances. Our excellent cooperation with the UN allowed us to underwrite security, logistical questions, and very, very efficiently. So, this is far from being a shortfall. I think it's been quite a remarkable and unique success. You referenced ongoing allegations of chemical weapons use. Well, for the first time also, we have sent the Director General of the OPCW, under his own authority, under the Convention, was able to send, with the agreement of Syria, a fact-finding mission to investigate those allegations. And work on the declaration is ongoing. Syria, obviously, as one of the very few chemical weapons possessor states of a large arsenal, is under enormous international scrutiny. So states parties are especially focused in the Executive Council of the OPCW to cross all T's and dot all I's. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'll let you go on because your institutional affiliation. And Angela Kane, please.
I may need to be accorded the same courtesy. Let me come back to the question of accountability, because as you recall that after the investigation mission issued its report, there were a lot of complaints, if I can call it that, an accusation. There was no mention of accountability. It's interesting to recall a little bit, and one of you already mentioned the the chemical weapons use that took place by Iraq, by Saddam Hussein against Iran and then the Kurds. And what happened there is there were actually 3 separate investigations of those incidents. And these 3 investigations, in fact, allocated accountability. They actually pinpointed, the person who was culpable. And it's also very interesting because just very shortly after that, that's when the Secretary General's mechanism was elaborated by member states. And they deliberately did not include the question of accountability in that mechanism. Now, again, this is 25 years ago, so I think time has moved on. But on the other hand, if you look at the proof that we had, or the report that was delivered, it did not hold up. It would not hold up in a court in terms of assigning responsibility. That was very clearly the feedback that we got. That was very clearly the conclusion that was drawn by the investigators and by the head of the team, Professor Sellström. So the thing is that right now what you have is 2118 resolution does raise the issue of accountability. It's very easy for the Security Council to pick up that issue. If it wanted to, it could have done so last year already. So this is not something where I think the finger pointing needs to go to the Secretary General, but really it is, where's the international action on that? Let me come back to, but the other thing that I think we need to also recall is that, yes, Syria, but remember Syria was the country that actually requested the investigation of the chemical weapons, and that was the attack in Aleppo. That's not been mentioned here, but it's relevant, because basically, I think if we had investigated, and I'm on record as having said that, if we had investigated right away that Aleppo incident, maybe we wouldn't have all of the subsequent uses of the chemical weapons that we then saw, and that were actually also preceded in a number of places like Homs and so forth, which go back to December 2012. So again, that's very important. We couldn't agree with the Syrians about access because I had different ideas than the Syrians did, and so that took a little bit of time, but in the end we got there. Let me mention one other issue, and I think you, Professor Schulte, mentioned the question of the samples. It's very interesting. This is the first time that we had real use of this mechanism. The samples actually belong to the UN, and we now have a legal approach to this, to the extent like they are stored in various laboratories, including in the OPCW. But on the other hand, I am not a scientist and I can't tell you that, but I really wonder whether a further analysis of the samples would actually pinpoint to the responsible party having carried out. I don't know that, I can't judge that, but I think that remains a big question mark. The last point that I have is basically we need to look also at the future. And when it comes to the OPCW, for example, you know that there have been various questions raised about differences between the declaration and so forth and what there could be left. And that comes to the fact of the challenge inspections. And the challenge inspections, which have never been used for political reasons, it'll be a very interesting test to see whether in fact they will be used in the Syrian case or not. And I would be interested to hear your reaction to that. Thank you.
Angela, I think we'll stop right here, come back to the panel in reverse order. I think Paul might have had the most of the comments, but Nomi to start, and then Paul, and then Richard. So Nomi, please.
I think there's only one question that Maurizio Martellini referred to me. I think the other questions are to Paul and to Richard. Maurizio, I think it's a great idea about the, creating a CWC, BWC free zone first. I very much doubt you'll get the Egyptians on board. I just don't see it happening. But I'm all for it in terms of where, they are so insistent that nuclear is the main issue that the zone is about, that for them reversing the order, I think, is not going to work. But I think I'm all for trying.
Thank you. Paul, you don't need to respond to everything, but pick up some key points.
First, Nomi, and perhaps Peter, I'm not criticizing the OPCW for what it was able to do, nor am I saying it could not do verification of what was declared to it. And I see no reason to doubt its ability. My concern is with the political constraints which may prevent it doing what the world would want it to do. And I speak as a former UNSCOM and UNMOVIC commissioner. I'm acutely aware of the way that the P5 can, by threatening vetoes and obstructions and criticisms, utterly paralyze whole areas of UN work. So I am not aiming at Ban Ki-moon or any part of his organization. I'm trying to remind this audience that the international environment in which these activities are going to have to be carried out is no longer propitious. We are, in fact, walking back from that brief honeymoon period after the end of the Cold War, when the Chemical Weapons Treaty was concluded. I was involved in working up the challenge inspection proposals. I invented the idea of managed access. The idea then was that challenge inspection would be a regular activity. It would be normal. That was prevented. There was a systematic diplomatic campaign, headed, I have to say, by Russia, to prevent that becoming an easy thing to do. So the question of whether it can be conducted in this Syrian circumstance is, I think, now quite problematic. And that climate can worsen. And if we're looking at the future of proliferation, let's be aware of that. This is not going to be an easy time in which to do it. Because the conflict between Russia and the West may have all sorts of theatres, and one of them may be obstruction of examination of Russian clients, as in the case of Syria. And there may be and other countries we haven't yet thought of. Just on the Israeli question, I'm not in the least qualified to talk about Israeli politics, and I suspect any Israeli decision will be taken in the light of internal domestic considerations and wider Israeli diplomatic strategy. Though I do observe that until the dust has finally settled in Gaza, this may not be the best time to try and get international attention to and sympathy for any Israeli move. But as I say, that's an amateur's sideline observation. On different definitions, don't know. I think the more... on threshold quantities, I don't know if that's practical. That's a question of OPCW capacity. And it might be that different definitions would be more important than threshold quantities because of all these technical changes and the problem of fifth generation and other agents which are so far unmentionable on the schedules, which will have to be confronted soon, and that may be a higher priority. Peter's point, yes, it was international pressure and horror, but it was really only the threat of American bombing, I think, which had its effect on an otherwise morally insensitive Assad regime. Don't confuse prosecution with accountability. Well, no, in theory, but they actually can't be separated. When whatever data is extractable from Syria is analysed, it will of course be considered by those who are worrying about assigning accountability for the Ghouta massacre. The operation was ad hoc. Yes, it was done well. International trade. Oh, all right, all of that. It was done well enough. But as I say, you wouldn't sit down and design the way the world was going to get rid of these things in the way it was done. And it's a good precedent that it showed success. But if this ever happens next time, I think there are some lessons to learn about how you do it more efficiently, with less strain, and as I say, how to deal with the problem of regional NIMBYism. Work on the declaration is ongoing, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's going to go well, does it? Again, the Iraq case, another embattled Ba'athist tyranny under international pressure to look at its programs, showed an extraordinary ability to stonewall in final phases. I don't know, but this is a wider problem about the OPCW model. I remember UNSCOM and UNMIFIC. I remember the compliance disputes in the US-Soviet Arms Control Treaty, which were conducted in relative public. The OPCW process is behind closed doors. So it's very difficult for outsiders to get an idea of what's the extent of what's in dispute. What we get are statements by American ambassadors in the P5 and leaks by American and occasionally British officials. So exactly how this is going to be done and to what degree of international satisfaction, I just don't know. But back to Israeli and other decision, this is a test case. If this is not done well, and after all, why shouldn't one expect full Syrian revelations about a capability they promise they don't have anymore? If lingering suspicions linger, what does that show about the ability to trust the way the international system can deal with these things, which surely will repercuss on the Israeli decision? So there's a kind of leverage aspect from Israeli choices which should not be neglected.
Thank you, Paul. Richard.
Yes, I shall try to be brief. We're running low on time, and I think it would be very good to this enthusiastic audience to get another run of questions through. Just take a few points there. Our Angela's points about accountability and what evidence is produced is really important. I mean, part of our problem is we still haven't found a good answers to the question Fred Ickley raised in January 1961 of after detection what. You know, we often focus too much on the certain types of data and how much we can prove it, but not actually how we can actually use it to make improve the situation. Peter, yet the key point I think about the general purpose criterion is it stops all these loopholes. It covers everything, but people forget the comprehensive nature of it. And it is very hard to operationalize such a concept, which is why people end up reliant on lists. Which is why for national implementation we've got to make sure the general purpose criterion is identified or the concepts are embodied within national implementation. And just a final quick word on the Syrian declaration questions. I suspect the Syrian declaration is not going to be complete, not least because this was a program over many decades involving a number of people who weren't necessarily encouraged in such a society to write everything down. The key question is, the bits that aren't in the declaration, are they significant? And then the final political point is, the Russians were very involved in helping them prepare the declaration. The Russians had even made a comment after the declaration had been submitted that this was consistent with what they understood the Syrian program to be. As Syria's partner, and Syria being obviously a key client state, it is very awkward for the Russians if there happened to have been anything that Syria had not disclosed. So I think there's going to be some interesting political questions there.
Thank you, Richard. We're in the last round. This will be the speed dating round. The reputations will be enhanced by brevity. Oliver Meyer.
Thank you. I had a quick comment and a question. The comment was on the factors that led to the disarmament of Syrian chemical weapons. The outrage about the attacks on August 21st has been mentioned, and Paul just mentioned the fear of bombing. But what also made this possible, I think, was the shared interest by the United States and Russia and the shared fear that the Syrian chemical weapons may fall into the wrong hands, into the hands of the terrorist groups. And I mention that because that may be good news in terms of future cooperation between the United States and Russia related to problems of proliferation of chemical weapon capacities and other instances also. The question I had was on the decision to phase out the OPCWN joint mission and whether it wasn't maybe too early to take that step. Just yesterday, the United States alleged that there are still hidden stocks of chemical weapons in Syria. Paul just commented on the difficulty of having challenge inspections in Syria. So wouldn't it have been better to preserve at least part of this capacity, also because in light of the current relations between the United States and Russia, it may be difficult to get a Security Council decision again on such a mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. A gentleman in the far right.
Thank you. Dimitri Leopoulos from the IISS Non-Proliferation Disarmament Department. I'm also the EU delegate to The Hague, to OPCW. We needed at least 5-6 hours, to complete this debate. I'll try to be brief because it has to be commensurate to the length of the Executive Council debates on Syria. Anyway, now, one thing that should not elapse our attention is that with the Syria chemical weapons destruction operation, the CWC itself has been breached deliberately by the international community in the sense that it does not provide for exporting the chemicals of a possessor state and destroying them abroad. Why I'm saying that? Because I'm coming to the point made by Richard that if there is political will, you can circumvent, let's say, provisions that normally state parties to the convention hate to do. But this applies also to many other aspects of the Syria chemical weapons operation, which we don't have time to expand now. But my question to the panel is that if we have managed to do that in the case of Syria, would it be a precedent that could be used in other cases, for instance, in Libya? Because, again, we have a problem there. One of the issues of not destroying the chemicals in Syria was the security situation, perhaps the costly construction of an incineration plant. I mean, there were reasons. I mean, it was not without a reason that the international community have agreed to that. But would you see it as a precedent that could be used in other cases? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Scott Davies, please.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Scott Davis from the U.S. State Department. Nomi, thank you for your interesting discussion of considerations applying to both Israel and Egypt joining the CWC. Of course, these are two key states who are also not party to the BWC. And I wondered if you could talk about considerations that apply there, perhaps comparing and contrasting what you said about the CWC. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. WPS Sidhu?
Thank you very much. 2 points very briefly. One is, while not discounting the role that Anscombe and UNMOVIC played, particularly in Iraq, it was very much a product of its time. And, in some ways, because the OPCW didn't exist, for example, and everybody sort of argues and claims that, the IAEA was much more effective in some ways in what they were doing at that point in terms of the disarmament. But I think more importantly, you can see, the difference between the number of resolutions which have passed, the number of bombings which were done to actually enforce the various resolutions, and the fact that 2118 has been successful to the extent that it has without any bombing and the presence of the OPCW being able to do and depoliticize the process as far as possible. It still remains political, but I think that's a progression. The question I had really was, while one tends to discount, the ability of having consensus in the Council, if you look at Resolution 2118, it's actually particularly far-reaching in the context of 1540. Whereas, the Syrian declaration was in fact false, where they basically said they had no WMD. And 2118 now says, and I just quote very quickly, that all UN members need to inform immediately the Security Council of any violations of Resolution 1540. This really empowers the 1540 committee to look at all the submissions, which they were not doing before because they were all voluntary, and they still are. But then this raises the question of, is the 1540 committee, as it is now constituted, adequate for that task? Thank you.
Thank you, WPS. Rogelio Ferte, please.
Thank you very much. Just a brief reflection on something which has been said here, the significance of US-Russia cooperation in terms of non-proliferation, disarmament treaties. When you look at the history of the CWC and its relative success, Russian-US or US-Russian cooperation has been there all the time, and it's been key to the ability of the international community to move forward on this issue. If you ask Gorbachev, he will tell you he's the father, one of the fathers of the Chemical Weapons Convention, because it was Gorbachev and Reagan who agreed in 1988 that there should be a convention, and from then on, it's always been U.S.-Russia cooperation and concurrence on supporting the objectives of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which has been behind the progress, because the two countries declared the stockpiles, the two countries have moved forward successfully, if not entirely, on the destruction plan, and it's the two countries which have agreed on what to do with Syria. I think the Chemical Weapons Convention would have not stood a chance had Russia and the United States not agreed. And I think that's also a lesson for other issues, and that's why I think we should all look with serious concern when related to non-proliferation, disarmament, about the current situation in U.S.-Russian relations. It's been key to it. Concerning the OPCW itself, I think it faces several challenges. Some have been mentioned. Certainly, developments in science and technology pose a big question mark for the future. The issue of universality is crucial. I think we should look at Israel and Syria, but also to North Korea. I think that the international community has failed to put on North Korea enough pressure in order to try to get them into this. And Security Council resolutions do obligate North Korea to come clear also on chemical weapons. Thank you.
Thank you, Helio. It's 10 o'clock. It's time to stop. I've had a consultation with the organizers who have given me another 5-10 minutes. So we'll take 3 more very quick interventions, come back to the panel for final quick words. Carlo Trezza.
Very briefly, like Paul Schulte, I was impressed, negatively impressed, I must say, by the lack of solidarity of the international community when it came to the destruction of the chemical weapons of Syria. And therefore, as lessons learned, really introduce, I would say, in the UN resolution, the pertinent UN resolution, also an appeal to countries to cooperate actively in the destruction. Here, I think for once one has to pay tribute to the United States, because they have been leading this operation, and the inventiveness of destroying chemical weapons in international waters was something unprecedented, and I think should be remarked. To Nomi, just a short question. You believe that ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention by Israel could and should be made independently from whether Egypt would join as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo. Kehan Barzagar, please.
Yes, thank you. Kehan Barzagar from the Institute for Middle East Strategic Studies. Regarding the Russian-American chemical weapon disarmament in Syria, I was wondering if there was any security guarantee behind this deal. If this is the case, then there is a lesson to be gleaned, and that is without security guarantee in the context of regional equation or global equation, there would not be this kind of disarmament. I have a comment, and that is Iran's role in proposing the initial plan of convincing the Syrian regime to go in that direction. And that is because of the fact that Iran was the victim of Iran-Iraq war chemical weapon used. And the lesson would be that the background is very important to force the states going in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Kehan, for that observation. And Mohammed Shakir, you have the last word from that side of the panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think Egypt and Israel, the way forward for joining the Chemical Weapon Convention is through the negotiating a zone free of weapons of mass destruction. This is the best vehicle, in my view, to achieve this. I remember when Egypt adhered to the NPT, that year we were very encouraged by Israelis' attitude in joining the consensus in the General Assembly so I think we have a very good chance to work on this issue through negotiations on the weapons of mass destruction zone. We can, and definitely we would also, not only chemical but also biological weapons are very important. And if we succeed in these negotiations to create a verification system for the biological weapons, it would be also a great achievement. So I think it's through the weapons of mass destruction zone we can achieve this. But unfortunately, we discovered that the Israelis wanted to enlarge the talks and include other regional security issues. I think, and this has blocked any agreement on moving forward. And I must take the opportunity to really pay great admiration to the facilitator who did his best. But with these new objections by the Israelis, things are not moving.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed. We'll come back to the panel for very short, not addressing all of the points, but the key ones that need to be addressed.
Thank you very much. On the questions of challenge inspection, I think the key thing to me is I don't think it will necessarily be a CWC challenge inspection mechanism that would actually be used in Syria. Resolution 2118 allows for certain access rules outside of the CWC rules, and I suspect they would be used. Dimitri's point on the CWC breach is a very interesting one. There were many legal questions about whether these things could be transferred, whether you'd have to effectively amend the CWC through a Security Council resolution. It was realised there was a gap in the definition of permitted purposes. Disposal is not a permitted purpose. If it were, it's very easy. The general purpose criterion would apply. If your intention is to dispose of that material, you're allowed to possess it. The precedent of Syria, very important. The assumption in planning in the past was there would be a long run into any future destruction of new CWC possessor. We've seen the situation of a civil war and the problems that have. The other scenario that could well happen is the collapse of an economy such as North Korea. I think we have to give real thought to how we would deal with such a thing. And the question about security assurances, I think it's a very interesting one. There was a whole range of the Kerry-Lavrov process that was behind closed doors, and I suspect there were some interesting messages between Russia and Syria about what political bargains there were, and some of those things may come home to roost in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Paul?
This may be to Richard or to Oliver, but the point about the difficulty of understanding a very long-term Syrian program is one where I think there is a remedy, and it was one that UNSCOM stumbled on. It's the technical evaluation meeting, which was very successful and largely forgotten. It was a system that involved the discussion and questioning of the technical directors of the Iraqi programs by technical equals from around the world, Russians, Chinese, as well as Westerners, asking them to please explain the purported history. That was very effective. It reflected what was believable and what was not believable. It is a form of conversation that it seems to me could be very well applied in the Syrian case and more widely. In my wider terminology, it gets to reduce diplomatic autism, that it's necessary to explain why technical directors cannot give evidence about programs which are renounced forever. If that cannot be done, if there is a refusal to do that, if Westphalian opacity is privileged in a way which stops that, then that is a very serious indicator of what can be achieved or what can't be achieved. So we were asked to think of new thinking. This is, I think, old thinking which should be reviewed, and it should be used as one of a number of tests of what's possible in the Syrian case. I won't make every point, but Oliver's point about the fear of terrorism was one of the factors, not just American bombs. Yes, and indeed Samantha Power yesterday in the UN was making the same point. We have to get this right in Syria. Otherwise terrorists might get it. So it's a kind of Syria must be disarmed statement, which I think we should all chant. But it's not exactly simple, because ISIS and the fear of terrorism is going to work in the other way. I think there will be a reduced disposition to put pressure on the Assad regime and bring them to account if that were to seem to assist the Islamic State. So doing this in the civil war has all kinds of problems, and we shouldn't ignore that.
Thank you, Paul. Nomi.
Thank you, Mark. I'll be very brief. Mohammed Shakir and Carlo Tretz asked a very similar question. I'm not opposed to the CWC obviously being adhered to by both Israel and Egypt through the WMD-free zone, but I see no reason to sort of wait for that. I think I'm not opposed in any way. On the contrary, I'm advocating moving forward with a slightly different plan to get Israel to accede to ratify the CWC by working through these various groups and through creating public opinion, since at the moment the Prime Minister and his office definitely need something. So that goes back to Paul. They have dug themselves into such a deep hole with not only what happened in Gaza, but also with the aftermath and the declaration of expanding the Gush Etzion settlements. So this would actually, being able to ratify, they've created a new unit only this week in the Military Advocate's Office to fend off, recruiting international lawyers to try to fend off allegations of violations of international humanitarian law and potentially war crimes in Gaza. So this is an issue where it's not a coalition issue. There shouldn't be any objection from the right-wing parties. And that answers Scott's question about BWC. The very same applies. Obviously, you have to tailor the groups to discuss issues specific to the BWC that are of potential concern. But the general framework, working with Israeli opinion shapers, civil society, politicians, to create awareness of the benefits of ratifying both conventions. It's just that this panel was about chemical weapons, which is why I didn't address it. But the same theory very definitely applies with a slightly, just has to be tailored in terms of the working group and the actual work with the, with the opinion shapers and the like. But definitely, I think that there are good prospects for Israel to ratify both, potentially before Egypt does, and then it would put pressure on Egypt to do so.
Thank you, Nomi. I was sitting here trying to work out how I could use the conference app to take a vote of the participants, how many cheers to give to the Syrian chemical weapons dismantlement exercise. Is it 2.3 as Paul suggests, or I'm more inclined to give it the 3 cheers that Peter suggests. But I do know that we owe 3 cheers to the panelists, so please join me in thanking them for stimulating this. We resume at 10:30 in the respective rooms on the first and second floor. Brilliant, brilliant. You're good. No, you are. You're really good. Really good. Thank you so much for joining. We needed you.